more from this phone call between Vladimir Putin and President Trump. Alexandria Hoff is rejoining us now live at the White House. So, Alex, you've had a chance to dig through more of the readout from the White House. We also have a readout and more details coming from the Kremlin, including Putin, according to the Kremlin readout, Putin telling President Trump that he was ready to jointly work out ways to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, which should be sustainable. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, I think, Sandra, the question is coming from all of this, the White House readout, and what's coming from the Kremlin side is what's really happening on the immediate front here. It doesn't sound like a ceasefire deal has been handshaken, over, sealed and dealed at this point. But what this shows is that there seems to be agreement on all sides at this point that the pathway to a ceasefire could be soon approaching. I thought this was interesting here. We have a quote that I'm reading from the White House readout. The leader spoke broadly about the Middle East as a region of potential cooperation to prevent future conflicts. They further discussed the need to stop proliferation of strategic weapons and will engage with others to ensure the broadest possible application. So the two sides, they both share the view, kind of peripherally to this, that Iran should never be in a position to destroy Israel. So while the Ukraine war was, of course, the important point of this conversation, much of this conversation also talked about the U.S. relations with Russia. Both sides say that those need to be improved there. But what we do believe will happen in at least the immediate, perhaps next couple of days, hours, perhaps even now, that negotiations will begin immediately in the Middle East on the implementation of a maritime ceasefire. They also talked about the importance for guaranteeing peace through energy and infrastructure ceasefire. So that's likely where we're going to see this work begin, at least on the maritime front, Sandra.
Right. Alex Hoff at the White House on that for us. Alex, thank you.
So I want to bring in now former CIA officer and station chief Dan Hoffman, who spent 5 years in those positions in Moscow. He's now a Fox News contributor. Dan, what are your thoughts? I want to put up this map. This is sort of the dream of new Russia. Russia claims that this is really the land that they should have in Ukraine. So give us a sense of whether or not they've got any hope of achieving that in this negotiation.
Well, I think that is Vladimir Putin's strategic objectives. Look, as you noted, I spent a lot of years of my life trying to see the world through the twisted KGB eyes of Vladimir Putin. And what's driving him is the destruction of Ukraine as an independent state. He wants to install a puppet regime. He likes to talk about NATO as a threat to Russia. NATO's a defensive alliance seeking to deter Russian aggression. What scares Putin is democracy, and he could never allow Ukraine to have commercial links with the European Union while building a functioning democracy. That's a threat to him, and it's a threat to his regime security. And so what he wants is for Ukraine not to be able to deter future Russian attacks. He might take a pause in the fighting. As Ben mentioned, he would want in return for that no military arms to Ukraine, so that Ukraine would be weaker while Russia would rearm. And I would just add one last thing. Putin doesn't share President Trump's abhorrence for war. Putin alone is responsible for hundreds of thousands of Russian casualties as well as civilian deaths in Ukraine. He doesn't care. It's just a statistic to him. And what matters to him is staying in power.
Yeah, we've seen that throughout Russian history, that they're willing to take an enormous amount of casualties in order to achieve their goals. Just put up this energy map, everybody, if you can, for me in the control room. And you look at this Zaporizhzhia reactor, 6 reactors right on the border of the fighting zone and Ukraine. And you see the other Chernobyl power plant. I mean, these are obviously some very dangerous sites that are the initial effort here to at least stop attacking these areas. Dan, your thoughts on that?
That's a good start. That's a good confidence-building measure. Once we get into the arena, diplomatic arena in the Middle East and carry on further negotiations, I think the onus will be on Director CIA Ratcliffe to steal secrets. That's what we do. And to learn of Vladimir Putin's plans and intentions and pain points and what he might be willing to give up or not give up. That's going to be the challenge going forward. But this, make no mistake, is a good start. It's a reasonable start. It's not everything that we want. But it's a good start. And as you said, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, there was grave risk there. to environmental damage, and it's a good thing that it's off the target list.
Well, the first phone call is done between Putin and President Trump, and we hope that we can get some good achievements out of all of this. Thank you very much, Dan. Good to have you here as always. Dan Hoffman.
Thanks.
Ceasefire in the Middle East breaks down as Israel opens fire on Hamas targets in the Gaza Strip. And in just the past hour, sirens blaring in southern Israel after a projectile was launched by Houthi rebels in Yemen. Let's bring in Michael Allen, former senior director of the National Security Council under President George W. Bush. So here's what the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz, said about the current situation. He said, quote, if Hamas does not release all the hostages, the gates of hell will open in Gaza, and Hamas murderers and rapists will meet the IDF with forces they have never known before. They think what's going on now is limited strikes, or is all hell broken loose?
I think they're going to go for whatever target they can find. So all hell breaking loose. I think the Israelis' only option at this particular time is to inflict more good old-fashioned pain upon Hamas, make them believe that the situation they're in now is worse than what they were in when there was a relative calm between the two parties. So Israel's going to go hard at them.
All right. So the conversation, and it lasted more than an hour and a half. It looked like it lasted more than 2 hours between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. They did come to some agreements to start negotiations in the Middle East. We assume Saudi Arabia, though we don't know for sure. But the New York Times putting a little more meat on the bone. I think this comes out of the Kremlin, that Putin says that he will pause attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure for 30 days, but is also demanding an end to all outside military assistance to Ukraine and an end to all intelligence sharing. Not sure that's going to fly.
I don't think it's going to fly. Trump was obviously there a week ago to sort of condition Zelenskyy into the ceasefire. But it seems like Putin is trying to get things that he would ultimately bargain for in a future negotiation front-loaded to the ceasefire. I don't think these are two big, gigantic pieces of leverage for President Trump. I don't think he wants to bargain them away at this early stage here. So what I think Trump ought to focus on is the success of Russia saying that they won't hit energy infrastructure, expand it to maritime, expand it to the ground, and lock these parties in some sort of negotiation in the coming weeks.
Of course, at any negotiation, right, you ask for the stars and you're satisfied with getting the moon and the sun.
That's right.
So is this Putin asking for everything and then he'll settle for something less?
I hope so. He certainly has asked for so many different things that are not deliverable at this point, including that Ukraine give up territory that the Russians don't even have yet, or acknowledge that they'll never get certain pieces of territory back. I don't think the Ukrainians are there quite yet, and I think Trump, as the ultimate leverage player, is going to have to condition Putin over time to give more.
All right. Well, we'll see if he can do it. I think he wants to have a relationship with Putin, and he can't right now. So.
That's right.
Michael, good to see you. Thank you. Sandra?
We are now entered into the 4th year of a vicious, terrible war in Ukraine after Russia invaded the country now nearly 4 years ago. President Trump, just a short time ago, after he completed this phone conversation, highly anticipated phone call with Vladimir Putin, they spent an hour and a half on the phone. At one point, Putin said that a condition is no more aid or intel to Ukraine, which, of course, they rely on heavily to keep going. There's a discussion of a 30-day ceasefire on infrastructure. So here's what President Trump, this is his first reveal after the phone call in terms of what he wants to share on Truth Social. He said, my phone conversation today with President Putin of Russia was a very good and productive one. We agreed, he says, to an immediate ceasefire on all energy and infrastructure, with an understanding that they will be quickly working to have a complete ceasefire and ultimately an end to this very horrible war between Russia and Ukraine. This war would never have started if I were president, ! He writes. Many elements of a contract for peace were discussed, including the fact that thousands of soldiers are being killed, and both President Putin and President Zelenskyy would like to see it end. That process is now in full force and effect, and we will hopefully, for the sake of humanity, get the job done. Senior correspondent Benjamin Hall is here. His new book, which is out today, is the sequel to Saved, which is his incredible story. This new book is called Resolute: How We Humans Keep Finding Ways to Beat the toughest odds. And the Fox Nation special, Resolute with Benjamin Hall, both out today. You can download that and watch it on Fox Nation. Ben, it's always good to see you. You know, I'm just struck by the parallel nature of your story and Ukraine's story as they try to stay resolute to survive as well. What do you think as you watch this back and forth? You've spent a lot of time covering these stories in Europe and this war in Ukraine about the outlines of this early deal.
Well, first of all, it's interesting because it's a partial ceasefire, they say. And the Russians have said that the order was immediately passed on to the Russian generals and military that they would no longer be attacking energy and infrastructure in Ukraine. Now, that's really positive. It's a step forward. But then there seems to be this caveat. We're not certain if it means hand in hand with aid and security being stopped, being given to Ukraine. And so, look, it is certainly a partial ceasefire, and every step in the right direction is a good one. But the Ukrainians will be looking at this and saying they already gave a lot of concessions. President Trump really forced them to the table. He held these back, and they came to a ceasefire. And they will be asking why more pressure isn't put on Putin to come up with a proper ceasefire. And remember, the ceasefire wasn't supposed to be unconditional. It leads to a peace deal. So it's supposed to be a 30-day ceasefire during which they discuss the other issues at hand. And that is the main one. But Putin at the moment seems to be sort of haphazardly moving into this first ceasefire.
So you wonder what the reaction in Ukraine will be. As President Trump said at the White House in that heated back and forth, they don't have a lot of cards right now in terms of negotiation to end this war, Ben.
No, and at the moment, Russia feels that it really is in the offensive and in the stronger position. They've just kicked the Ukrainians almost out of Russia in the Kursk area. That was a big card for the Ukrainians. They were going to, at one point, say, we'll give you back Kursk in exchange for keeping these pieces of land. So they've lost that. Vladimir Putin has been very clear that he wants conditions that Ukraine can never join NATO. There will be no European peacekeepers in there, that the aid in the military has to stop, that the 3 areas in the eastern Ukraine have to be Russian. Those are big, big demands. And so seeing how that aligns with Ukraine's demands, which are effectively all the opposite, is really tough to see. But with with Russia constantly taking territory, moving forward, it seems like a pretty good place for Russia at the moment.
It's interesting to look back at a speech that Putin gave in 2007, Ben. And he said, we have reached that decisive moment when we must seriously think about the architecture of global security. It was a speech in Munich, and he accused NATO of breaking a promise by expanding into Eastern Europe, and he called for an end to U.S. hegemony. Vladimir Putin's real goals in all of this have been really consistent throughout his acquisition of Crimea and Georgia and all the moves he's made into Ukraine.
Yeah, and if you look at the writing that he's done, he's very keen on enlarging Russia and going back to perhaps the Soviet empire as it used to be. Now, no one quite knows if it is because he is trying to push NATO back, he sees that as a threat, or whether he just wants to continue expanding the Russian empire. So getting to the real basis of what drives Putin is interesting. But we do know that he wants to leave a legacy behind him, and part of that legacy is expanding. So many people feel that even if you have a peace deal at the moment, that in a few years they are greatly fearful that Putin will try again, which is why one of the key demands on the Ukrainians is that you must make it in any peace deal a porcupine state. You must give it enough weapons that Russia can no longer attack in the future. That's a main issue Putin will push back against. Yeah,
we've heard the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, talk about that. Give us one sort of resolute snippet, Ben, to give us an insight into why you wanted to write this book and what your message is to the people who followed your story.
It's interesting because really the book is about healing from the scars of war. We talk about Ukraine, we see what's happening in Gaza, and I think the key message is that, look, as bad as things can be, and I've experienced the worst myself, you can always get through it. You have to find a way through it. You find the resilience, you adapt, and you keep building. Not only can you keep rebuilding, I like to think that you can get stronger when you go through struggle. Now, I found that I used to think that being in hospital was going to be the most difficult moment. But what I discovered actually was that when I got home and I didn't have the doctors and the nurses and the physios, that it became even harder. realigning yourself with your injuries and the impact that has is difficult. And I share that with the thousands of people who have reached out to me who say they're having difficult times at home. And what I've tried to do in this book, if I try to tell stories that I've gone through, both the good moments, but also the very bad moments. And I talk about the flashbacks, I talk about the TBIs, I talk about the pain. But in each one, I try to describe how I got through them feeling optimistic, how I managed to get through them. And I just hope that this book will help people who are going through something difficult. I hope it'll be a page turner as well. And look, I'm very proud of it, but it's a very personal book, so we'll have to see how it's received.
Well, we know you're going to inspire a lot of people with this book, and we know it's a page turner because you wrote it, and you've done such excellent coverage. Your story is so inspiring to all of us, Ben, and it's great to see you.
That's great
to have you stateside. I know you got to get back to your family in London soon, so I'm so happy to have you here on the set today. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Martha.
So watch this phone call now. President Trump's going to hold a high-stakes call with Vladimir Putin today, pushing his bid for a ceasefire after more than 3 years of war over Ukraine. General H.I. McMaster, former NSA, National Security Advisor, Hoover Institute senior fellow right now. Good to have you back, General. Good morning to you. Some of the demands on behalf of Putin are here. Ukraine will not mobilize soldiers. Ukraine will not train soldiers. Ukraine will not receive foreign aid. And a lot of that foreign aid has to do with the demand that he'll make that there will be no arms shipments into Ukraine during this 30-day period. Will this fly? Can it fly?
Hey, Bill, no, it can't fly, but this is typical of Putin. What he's really going to try to do, I think, and what he's been trying to do, is try to get President Trump and the United States to accept a deal that is unacceptable to the Ukrainians, and then try to turn the United States not only against Ukraine, but against Europe, because really what Putin wants to do is break apart the NATO alliance, break apart the transatlantic alliance, and be able to continue his broad effort, not just in Ukraine, but his broad effort to restore Russia to national greatness, essentially restore the Russian Empire. And so he's hoping for some kind of a power dividing relationship with the United States. And what he's expecting, and I don't think he's going to get it, but he wants President Trump to help him up off the mat because he's put himself and he's put his country in an extremely weak position.
A couple things on that. If he were to get his way under the conditions I just listed, for a month, Russia could resupply all at once. North Korea, you name it. But Ukraine would be frozen in battle. Zelensky's not going to go for that.
No, and the Ukrainian people who've suffered so much, are not going to go for it, all right? We have to remember that Russia also has been trying to offload responsibility for the war that they initiated. You could say going back to 2003 when they poisoned a Ukrainian presidential candidate, but certainly in the first invasion in 2014. Remember, 15,000 Ukrainians died between 2014 and the massive reinvasion in 2022. So they've been at war, for a decade, the Ukrainians, and they've suffered tremendously. The Russians have kidnapped their children, and rubbled their cities and murdered civilians and raped civilians and executed prisoners. And I mean, the list goes on. So I think what you're seeing with Putin is an effort to pursue, kind of an Orwellian reversal of the truth, in which he wants to offload responsibility for the war, and then he wants to deny Ukraine the ability to continue to defend themselves. It's important to note.
Yeah, General, when
Russia's broken every agreement.
I get it, and that's what Zelensky said too. I mean, he said it in the Oval Office and repeatedly. When you say that Putin's trying to reestablish the Russian Federation, you're not talking about the USSR, are you? I mean, he doesn't care about Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, and that's not the point you're making, are you?
Well, he wants those countries to have a servile relationship with him, so he continue to dominate them. And really, what he's hoping to achieve, I think, now after he's put his country in this position where they've suffered such massive losses. Remember, Bill? I mean, we've been talking a lot about like the Russian offensive and the effect it's having. The Russians have taken probably about 40 to 45% of the casualties they've taken the whole war just in the past year, in 2024 alone. It's unsustainable. So what he wants to do is get out of this position of weakness. In many ways, Vladimir Putin is in the position in 2025 that Iran was in a decade ago in 2015. And what Iran got Barack Obama to do is pull them up off the mat And I think what Putin's hoping is that President Trump will do the same thing to him with the deal that throws the Ukrainians under the bus and that helps Russia, escape, the very difficult, the weak position Russia's in. I don't think President Trump will do it, but you see, this is really what he's trying to achieve. It's pretty transparent, in the statements that he's made and the concessions that he wants to make up front. And, the thing with the Russians is, if you make a concession, it's not like going to say, oh, wow, that's really a gesture of goodwill, and now we're going to negotiate in good faith. They just pocket it, that concession, and go on to make unreasonable and infeasible demands.
If I could, just to finish on this, Steve Witkoff was with Putin for hours last week. And the two men, Trump and Witkoff, spent the weekend together. So how much of a measure does Witkoff have about what Putin's willing to concede at this point?
Well, he's a smart guy, so I'm sure he's smart enough to read between the lines with Putin. But what Putin does, is he, first of all, he flatters you, tells you like, oh, you're the one guy who's going to be able to, bring us in from the cold. And then what they do is they try to get you to sympathize with them by creating this kind of sense of aggrievement. And so many people have fallen into that trap, the belief that, hey, all we really need to do is just allay, Russia's security concerns. But what they miss is that, hey, Vladimir Putin has aspirations that go far beyond anything that's in relation to what we do. And multiple presidents have fallen for this, And President Trump won't fall for it, I don't think. But, there's a long track record, of not only U.S. but European leaders who have fallen for, Vladimir Putin's subterfuge.
Well, we'll see what comes of it. General, thank you for your time. We're out of time now. H.R. McMaster, come on back.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.